We are looking at, in this session, at understanding the impact that COVID-19 has had on gender equality and how we can accelerate the pace of change. Recent research has recently shown that UK women took on more household care and home education than men during lockdown, and they were also more likely to be furloughed if they had children. During this conversation, we have a team of expert panelists, and we'll be exploring the damage that's been done to date and what we can do to overturn that and actually to move forward in a progressive way. I'm delighted to be joined by, as I mentioned, a real expert session of panelists. So firstly, if I'd like to introduce Joeli of Pregnant Then Screwed. Hi, Joeli.
Hi.
So Joeli is the founder of the charity and campaigning group Pregnant Then Screwed, which I'm sure you're all familiar with. She established in 2015, having had her own experience of pregnancy discrimination. Joeli also writes for The Telegraph. She's the winner of the Northern Power Women Agent for Change Award, is an Amnesty International human rights defender and a member of the United Nations Working Group, Women's Human Rights in the Changing World of Work. She's written a book, Pregnant Then Screwed, The Truth About the Motherhood Penalty, which will be published by Simon & Schuster on the 4th of March next year. I always feel completely in awe, Joeli, when I talk about the work that you've done so far and that I must do more. So thank you so much for joining us today. I'm also joined by Virginia Herlihy, who is the founder of How Do You Do It, who is a specialist international coaching company, a global organisation founded by Virginia, as I mentioned, in 2006. So How Do You Do It provides support for working parents and their managers. They work with individuals, managers and the wider organisation. They enable working mothers, fathers and all carers to successfully navigate dual roles at work and at home. I've had numerous conversations with Virginia about this, and she always makes me feel like I need to change what I'm doing and gives me loads of great ideas so I can vouch for the great coaching through the company. They do this through virtual and face-to-face group coaching and create powerful long-term networks and role models, facilitating best practice across organisations. So she's got some great case studies that she can share with us today. I'm also joined by Anthony Fitzpatrick of Aviva. So Anthony, you've probably all heard of Aviva because they've been doing fantastic work in the flexible working space for a very long time. And Anthony was actually the original creator of the shared parental leave policy that Aviva came up with in 2017. He also created the conflict resolution and mediation policy in 2018. So Anthony, I've gone completely off key, Anthony, sorry, because I started talking about what I know about you rather than sticking to the bio. So Anthony's really keen to talk today about how to promote the philosophy of policy development and corporate values and how that can drive cultural change, greater employee engagement and well-being, along with improved customer experience, which I think is always interesting, how it goes hand in hand, the improvement of an organisation right through to the experience that your customers then get. So thank you all so much for joining us today. I'd like to kick off, if I can, with everybody's thoughts really on the impact that COVID has had to date. So Joeli, if I start with you, I think you've been one of the kind of loudest voices on this and the kind of greatest instigator of the damage that this is doing. So Joeli, over to you.
So coronavirus, firstly, to say it's had a really detrimental impact on gender equality. The problems we're seeing are not new problems, they're problems that existed before COVID, and COVID has simply exacerbated challenges that already existed in our system. So what I specialise in is the motherhood penalty, all the challenges that women face when trying to have children and earn a decent living. So they have systematic disadvantage in terms of pay, perceived competence, promotion, all of that stuff. And there are many different factors that create this environment. COVID has had a detrimental impact on every single one of them. So as you said in your introduction, Madeline, you were talking about domestic labour, the fact that women are doing more in the home than men are. And we've seen from the Institute of Fiscal Studies that for every hour that women can do uninterrupted paid work time, men have 3 hours of uninterrupted paid work time. We know that before COVID, women were doing 60% of the domestic labour compared to men, 60% more of the domestic labour. They were doing more than double the amount of caring for their children. Obviously, coronavirus meant schools were closed, childcare facilities were closed. And so this kind of pact that we had that allowed women to go out and work and have children, because there was this whole system in place, it vanished overnight. And so women now have had to take a step back from their paid employment. They're doing much less paid employment than they were before because they've got to homeschool, they've got to do all this housework. They've essentially got 3 jobs in one. Knock-on effect of that has been that now that furlough is coming to a close, furlough was essentially a waiting room for redundancy. Those women, because they were forced to take this step back from their paid work, are now being pushed out of their jobs because they are being seen as a burden. So we are seeing from our own research that mothers are the first to go. 15% of mothers say they either have been made redundant or they expect to be made redundant in the next 6 months. And just under half of them say the reason they are going to be made redundant is because of childcare. This is a generational rollback in maternal employment. So if we look at what's happened over the last 24 years, it's taken us 24 years to increase maternal employment by 13%. We're seeing that we're going to now reduce maternal employment by more than that. And once these women are out of the workforce, it's very difficult to get them back in because mothers have very specific challenges compared to other types of workers. They need childcare in place, and we have the second most expensive childcare system in the world in the UK, and they need part-time and flexible working, and we know that only 14% of jobs are advertised as flexible. So getting them back in once they're out is very, very difficult. So it's very frightening what is happening at the moment, and we're seeing complete inertia from the government on this issue. It has been raised repeatedly in Parliament, and Boris Johnson's response has been, well, we expect employers to be understanding, as if, you know, all employers are this sort of moral barometer of goodness and that all they care about is their employees. What they care about at the moment is the fact that they are hemorrhaging money. They're desperately trying to keep their business afloat. And if they see that a member of staff is a problem, inevitably they are going to push them out of the workforce. It's the government's responsibility to step in and smooth over that problem, but they're doing nothing, absolutely nothing at all.
Thank you, Joeli.
Yeah, I just want to add to a few things you've said there, Joeli. I mean, I think you're absolutely right that what's happening at the moment has always been happening in terms of the things that you're talking about. I mean, women have always have been up until now behind. They're behind at work because they have less senior positions, are less well paid. And they're behind at home because they're doing far more on the unpaid and caring work. And up until now, they've been associated, or women with children have very much been associated with they're the people who do flexible work. And certainly anecdotally in the programs that we run, as well as mentioning the research, but you've already mentioned that, Joeli, we are finding even during the COVID period when things are very intense for people and actually organisations are coming to us saying we really need to help our parents, which is a great thing. Who do we have on the calls? 80% of them are women. There's only a small percentage of men who are attending those calls. And when we hear anecdotally from those women, they are the ones who are picking up on more of the home learning. And that's giving them another rod to beat their own back with because they don't think they're doing a good enough job of being a teacher either when they're actually not a teacher. So it's a combination of a very difficult set of circumstances. I think the ray of light, and I like to try to be an optimist on this because I do see some organisations doing some really good things, yours included, Anthony. But the silver lining here is that an enabler, and you've mentioned it, Joeli, of flexible work, of gender equality is flexible work. And for the first time, men have had to take flexible work in large numbers. And what's positive about that, although we're also hearing, is that they've taken to that very positively and are wanting that. And as we were talking before this call, Anthony, about the fact that many organisations are finding people want to keep a combination of that, men and women. And as we do more of that, I think there's an opportunity here for organisations and individuals to shift the dial and say, we don't have to go back to that. Men and women can continue to do this. And as men and women continue to do this, that at least can also have a positive impact on what we're doing around gender equality. So I do think there's some light on the horizon from that perspective. Anthony,
I agree. Yeah, I agree, Virginia. And And I think if there was anything that's positive that would have come out of kind of the past 6 months, I think societally the narrative's changed, because the whole concept of how we work, where we work, when we work has been completely thrown in the air.
Yes.
And if people, I think, I don't, maybe none of us on the call would have thought in September 2020 we'd be talking about smarter working, flexible working, how that's had an impact. I think that's really forced the agenda, it's forced the narrative. So I think if anything good has come out of that, it's really now challenged those preconceptions around this can't work, where we've proved that actually smarter working, more flexible working can work. You know, a lot of organizations, ours included, have continued to keep our service to the customer completely static throughout the lockdown. So I think it's kind of enabled us to kind of engage with our people, I think, and to understand what it is they need and what it is they want kind of in that employment contract going forward. So I think, yeah, it's been a really difficult time. You know, all the challenges of trying to balance home life, work life, homeschooling, all that. I mean, it's been a really tough time, but I'm confident in terms of, I think it's really pushed the narrative to probably far ahead, I think, of where we ever thought we would get to. And it's now, I think, about keeping the momentum, Madeline, really, of how we kind of keep this on the agenda.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And interesting, Anthony, you were saying earlier that Aviva haven't furloughed anybody. How have your, I was just going to ask, in terms of your kind of working parents, how have Aviva supported your working parents?
Yeah, so I mean, we made a strategic decision that we wouldn't furlough any of our employees. Obviously, we moved to the home working arrangements very, very quickly. That there were some kind of logistical challenges, particularly around kind of customer contact centres. But, you know, it was kind of making that investment in our people around giving them the tech they needed, giving them the IT equipment that they needed. So kind of taking those parts of that whole thing around anxiety, around how will I do my job? How can I perform in my job? So kind of taking that away. The other thing that we kind of said was we understood, and I think, Joeli, it goes back to what you were saying in terms of the whole thing around balancing all these different priorities, some of which were all colliding at the same time. So we said, look, you know, we understood it was a very, very difficult situation, and we took a flexible approach to say, look, try and do the hours that you can. We understand that there'll be times when you can't, and we've just kind of tried to manage that on a more local basis. So I think reinforcing that, talk to your leader, let's see what you can do, how can we help you, you know. And we've seen people kind of saying, look, I can do some hours in the morning, I need a break mid-morning when I'm doing maybe some schooling, but actually I'm happy to come and do some hours later. So again, it's kind of just changing that whole conversation around, I can do the work, I can support the business, I can support the customer, I can make a valid contribution, but it doesn't necessarily have to be between 9 and 5.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's so refreshing to hear about the work that Aviva do, especially as such a large employer, you know, kind of balanced with some of the horror stories that we're hearing. It's amazing to hear that they have furloughed and you have really supported working parents. Joeli, do we, is it too early yet? Do we have any stats on the redundancy fallout in terms of gender equality?
We don't have the exact stats. We expect them to be published within the next couple of months that will run up to June, and they will break down maternal redundancy, paternal redundancy, as well as the different genders and how that split is. But we have seen research now from the Institute of Fiscal Studies, from the Citizens Advice Bureau, and from Pregnant Then Screwed that is showing that parents, particularly mothers, are much more likely to be pushed out of the workforce. The Institute of Fiscal Studies said that mothers are 50% more likely to be pushed out of the workforce than fathers. Our own research was showing 15% of mothers going to be pushed out. And the Citizens Advice Bureau showed that parents with children under the age of 18 are 3 times more likely to be pushed out of the workforce than all other types of workers. So this is a serious problem. It's not just a problem for parents, it's a problem for disabled people. It's a problem for Black and ethnic minority people as well. If you have any, you know, if you're not a white, middle class, childless woman or man, you will be affected negatively by this virus, and you're much more likely to be pushed out of your job, unfortunately.
Yeah, and you're at risk. It's so sad to hear that. And what I have to ask, what's everybody's thoughts on the government cancelling the gender pay gap reporting this year? What sort of message do you think that sends?
Joeli's desperate. I mean, it's just the worst time to be cancelling gender pay gap reporting, because this is the time when we need to be monitoring exactly what's going on so that we can create policy around this problem. And gender pay gap reporting isn't perfect. It isn't a perfect measure for what is going on in the workforces by any stretch of the imagination, but it is a measure. And it is a way that companies have an opportunity to really dig deep and look at exactly what is happening in their organisations and why women aren't making it through to those higher echelons, why they're staying in lower paid work. There are other measures that we would also like to see implemented along gender pay gap reporting, but it could not be a worse time to cancel gender pay gap reporting. What I do find frustrating about gender pay gap reporting is that for the companies that have a large gender pay gap is over 18%, because it's 17.4% is the average gender pay gap in the UK. They are then unable to attract the staff that they want into their organisation, and they are chastised by the press. It's not only the responsibility of a company, that gender pay gap, it should be about really good policy across the board. And what I would really like to now see from companies is rather than them subserviently taking this punishment for having a large gender pay gap, to be working with organisations like Pregnant Then Screwed, to be lobbying the government for a better system and structure in the UK to ensure mothers are enabled to work. And I'm talking about childcare, I'm talking about paternity leave, I'm talking about flexible working legislation. Why companies are not joining forces with us to campaign and lobby the government to do something to change the system is beyond me. Instead, they're publishing these gender pay gap statistics and then, you know, trying to work internally to make things happen for mothers. But it's about a whole system. It's not just about individual companies.
Yeah, can I add to that, Joeli, in terms of some learnings, I think, because I've mentioned that we operate over a number of jurisdictions, and one of them is obviously the UK, but we also operate in Australia. And one of the things I think they do very well, in fact, they're world leading in this, and I think the UK could learn a lot from this, is they have a body called the Workplace Gender Equality Agency. And it is, so it's a government organisation, but it's an organisation that all leading employers want to be an accredited employer of choice for. And over the last 5 years, it's measured a whole range of statistics to do with gender. I also wear another hat. So I'm part of a group called Chief Executive Women here with senior female leaders in the country. And we're women leaders enabling women leaders. And we often work with WGEA, exactly as you're saying, to lobby on certain issues that are really important, like childcare is one of the ones at the moment. But going back to WGEA, what they do really well is they've had this 5 years of measuring this data, and all organisations have to put in their data. And then the criteria for being an accredited member and employer of choice continue to increase. They don't just stay static. You have to do more each year to be considered progressive on gender equality. Now that gets a lot of people's attention, and it gets a lot of potential employees in the market. It gets their attention, and people can be called to account. So it's very easy for that to be seen. And one of the things I'm personally very excited about is, because they've tracked this data over the last 5 years, they have now been able to prove, using an economics group as well, a causal link between an increase in women in more senior positions and the market share value of a company, to the tune of like millions and millions. So when you start to see that data is what gets us to where we need to get to, data within organizations is critical, and that's why I'm personally disappointed too. I'm being polite about the fact that the report the gender reporting was cancelled, because what kind of message does that say? Well, actually, we don't really need to report that now. And yet we absolutely need to report that now. And in organisations, I'm tired of people giving me opinions about the fact that actually, I think we're pretty good, versus data that proves that they are. We actually need more data in our organisations, and I think that's a good thing for people to have. Anyway, I'll stop talking now, Anthony. I think you were.
No, I was just going to say, maybe in terms of those employers who've really kind of faced into the challenge, and even and accept, are we where we'd want to be on the gender pay gap? But actually, I suspect for those who are really, really keen, whilst it's disappointing that obviously the report isn't going to be done this year, I think there's still the onus that actually, if you're going to do anything, you can't just take your foot off the gas because the report's not there. So I get the point around data, but actually, ultimately you will fall further behind. So hopefully organisations who are really, really wedded to that will continue doing the good things that they're doing, regardless of whether they've got to produce the report or not. So I don't want to undervalue that, because clearly that is a absolutely in a kind of integral part of what we want to see, and that data, as you say, does hold you to account. But I would hope that kind of employers will continue to think that we've got to continue on that journey. We can't just take our foot off the gas for 1 year, because that won't solve anything.
I think you're right, and I think the good ones do. I mean, and most of the clients we're working with do. That's probably the reason we're working with them, because they're already progressive like that. I think it's just the message it sends to people outside of that is it's an excuse to put it on the back burner, and we don't need any other excuses for that. So I totally agree. The good ones, I think, will be doing it anyway, Anthony.
And I know we've talked about recruitment and retention and how we're attracting people, and actually, this could be quite a defining moment where those who have taken their foot off the gas, and the gap does start to increase even more. It highlights the ones who've got really good strategic behaviours that are absolutely hardwired into what they do and how they want to tackle that. So maybe that will help in terms of saying, actually, this is a really good employer, because we know that they continue to do that work even when they didn't have to do the report.
To do it. Yeah,
absolutely. Joeli, can I just bring you in? I think you wanted to add something then.
Aviva obviously do some great work, but I do think, I'm afraid to say from my experience, I don't sit on the positive side. Sadly, I hear all the negative stories. And I personally feel that there are more companies that don't care about this than do care about this. And if we have a government that's going to send out a message that gender pay gap reporting is not important, that's going to have an even further negative impact on the way companies treat gender equality. And they've got to do work. It's not going to happen miraculously. They've got to do the thinking, they've got to understand the problem, and we find that many companies really don't understand the problem, and they've got to spend resources and time trying to unpick those challenges and how they can ensure women want to work for their company and can filter through to the top. We've seen so many incidences of diversity and inclusion managers losing their jobs during this crisis, because diversity and inclusion just isn't important anymore when you're in a crisis. Employers revert to conventional ways of working where the bottom line is king, and all the other fluffy stuff, as they see it as, just disappears. We've seen HR companies offering webinars, seminars, where they can talk employees through how they reduce their expenditure by changing employment contracts. Who's that going to affect? That's going to affect women. It's going to affect Black, Asian, ethnic minority and disabled women in particular. We're just seeing a real explosion at the moment of change within organisations that will negatively impact women in particular.
I think it's so interesting that we've got such different kind of, and probably every single aspect of what's happening, because obviously, Joeli, with your helpline, you hear the absolute worst of what's going on, and probably very real stories and very human stories. It must be quite emotional, actually, being part of your organisation. Apparently, Virginia, obviously you do as well, because you have the the organisation side of it and some great best practice, but equally you're speaking to people and you know, kind of living and breathing the parents that are trying to homeschool and manage what they're doing,
That's
and are on
right.
fair, etc. And Anthony, you've done such amazing work with Aviva that actually you're one of the few organisations that can put their hand on the heart and say, you know, this isn't going to have an impact on our equality and gender, because we've supported our people and we've done some great practice. So I'd really like to move us all on a bit to talk about, I mean, it's interesting as well, actually, that we're talking about how much responsibility organisations should have and how much onus should be on the government. And I think we've all agreed that organisations need to care about this, but we need more support from the government. What I'd really like to do is move us forward, and I think you can all contribute to this, to talk about what organisations can be doing, not just in terms of COVID now, but also, Anthony, we touched earlier on about future proofing. So what can we do to improve the damage that's been done in the organisations that have suffered damage in terms of gender and the women really that have suffered, but also how do we future proof, and how do we not let this happen again?
Yeah, and I think for me, that's where you kind of take your corporate values and your corporate philosophy, and in terms of then how can your employees see that you're living those values that are so important to you as an organization. And I think, you know, as we said earlier, you know, if we thought in September 2020 we'd be really starting to think about how we work in a different way, I don't think any of us probably around the table thought we would be at this juncture where we are today. So, you know, we're kind of in this transitionary phase at the moment in terms of still in kind of the kind of COVID scenario. What are the learns we've taken from that? We know what the challenges have been. Where have been the positives, and how can that help direct the conversation now to how do we future-proof the organisation to work in different ways? Because I think there's I think when I can honestly say, having spoken to our representative bodies, our trade unions, having done numerous surveys throughout the whole lockdown period with our employees, and you see what's happening societally, there has been a real sense of the narrative moving on, that people are saying, you know, how do we want to use our office space? How do we want to engage and collaborate with our colleagues? How do we want to support what's right for the business, what's right for the customer? How can that help me? So I think what I'm seeing is it's kind of really helping to formulate our ideas now about not just flexibility. I think it's that whole thing about smarter working. So for me, you know, smart working is about how we work, where we work, when we work. And I think one of the positives, as I said, is really kind of now taking that and implementing a model that will work for the future. And that really should start to tackle some of those gender issues, I hope.
Yeah. You know, and adding to that, I mean, I think that one of the things that I've really noticed positive, what organisations are doing really positively, is they are getting input from their people, probably in a way, more of a way than they have before. I mean, you mentioned the surveys that you're doing, Anthony. I think that's very common across our clients. There's a lot more surveying of people going on, a lot more reaching out to them, not just for how they're feeling, but also what they think some of the solutions are. So I think sometimes the leadership think they're the ones who have to solve all the issues, but actually they don't. People have got some very good ideas. They just need an opportunity to be heard, and they need there to be a recognition that there isn't just one version of success. There are many different versions of success, and that's why flexibility is an enabler of people working in different ways versus all the same way. So Anthony, at the moment you're in the office. Yeah. I'm at home. You know, so people can work in different ways, and that needs to be okay. So I think that's that flexibility that you're talking about. I think the narrative has absolutely shifted. So, but it's now what we do with that narrative, and our people and engaging with people is a key for that, because we'll get many more versions of success out of this than we have currently.
Yeah. Absolutely. Joeli, do you have kind of thoughts about how organisations could improve? Well, I'm sure you do, but so no, I didn't mean that. Sorry, I didn't mean that in a rude way. I mean, I'm sure you must have so many ideas about what we could be doing better.
I mean, to start with what Virginia talked about earlier, that there is so much evidence that if you have more women in your senior levels within an organisation, that you're more profitable, your business is more profitable. You retain women in the workforce, your business is more profitable and more productive. That is a fact. There is so much research about that. So it is in companies' best interests to create an environment that really supports and nurtures women, that allows them to have children and be great at their jobs. And there are many different factors that ensure that that is possible. Obviously, flexible work is one, and we've talked quite a lot about that. We want to have companies where they ensure fathers can take time out to care for their children as well as mothers, so that there's equality. We want to ensure that when mothers return to the workforce, that they are really looked after and taken care of, and that they're given a chance to settle back in, rather than either forcing them to hit the ground running or demoting them or sidelining them when they return, which is what we see really very often. Again, what Virginia touched on, and Anthony, about really engaging your workforce in what needs to change, we see really positive impacts from that. A bottom-up structure whereby you create women's groups, you give them a budget, you give them time and opportunity to have conversations about what needs to change, and you give them a direct line to the CEO so that they can say, this is what we need in order to stay in these jobs, and these are the problems that we're facing as we progress through the organisation. Those are all really fantastic tactics, but the one thing, again, going back to data, that we would really like to see companies doing is to track maternal retention rates. So let's look at who you bring into your organisation when they have children. Do they return to their job? If they don't return to their job, what's their reason for not returning? And do you continue to promote them? Do they continue through the organisation? Gather that data, assess it, analyse it, and start to understand where the problems are when they're hitting that glass ceiling, and how you can make a difference. And that will really change the demographic of your organisation.
That's a really interesting point. And also, I think it's specifically maternity because of the government schemes around maternity and paternity leave. Anthony, I'd like to ask you about this point that Joeli's just made about tracking, because you have this absolute flagship shared parental leave scheme, which it'd probably be helpful to explain more about, but it'd be really interesting to understand how that then impacts your men and women, your mothers and fathers retentions rates post.
So yeah, so I suppose what we did is in 2017 is we wanted to, and we introduced a parental leave policy which we called equal parental leave, and we really wanted to kind of degender parental leave, because I think we'd always recognised that actually, you know, there's a bias that women were always seen as the ones that took the longest period of leave. The men historically took a much shorter one. They took it maybe at a different time. So there was always a kind of perceived notion that men were more flexible, women were more higher risk in terms of taking longer periods of leave. And the leave that they took was kind of quite defined in the period when they took it. So actually what we said is we took gender out of that, which hopefully started to de-risk the situation, to kind of say, actually, it's irrelevant what your gender is. This is all about actually taking the leave. So there was the well-being piece around, actually, it's just good for you and the family to have that time when you've got a newborn child. And that's just the right thing to do. But I think, again, what we wanted to really try and do is just take that whole thing around gender. Now, I think what we have seen, and Joeli, you made some interesting observations there around tracking and retention. I mean, what we've seen is fantastic levels of retention around people taking that leave. And if you look at the amount of leave, we've got a lot of men. It's 50-50 now who've taken leave since we introduced the policy. So I think what that shows is men do want to be involved. I think if you give them the tools, they will do that. So I think that's great in breaking down some of those gender stereotypes. But it also then starts to prove that it's not just women that want and do take those longer periods of leave. So, I think in terms of from both of those aspects, it's achieved what we wanted. And if I look at the retention rates, Joeli, going back to your point, I think the vast majority of our people who've taken the leave have all come back, and which is good. And we are tracking that. So we do regularly track in terms of people that have been on leave when they come back. And as you say, the next thing now is really taking that to the next level, in terms of looking at their career and salary trajectories when they come back?
Yeah, that's what I was going to add, because I think that what we generally find is that if you only measure the retention when they come back to work, that's a little flawed, because many people will keep the job they're in. They're not going to go, oh, I'm having a new baby, I'm going to change job at the same time. That's generally too much. Where we also need to be tracking it is further down the track, and how are they doing that transition from being back to progressing. So I think the other place where a lot of bias hides is in our processes around evaluation and in our processes around promotion. And so there's work to do there. And I heard it very neatly put at a conference before, where people talked about the fact we need to take the bias out of the system, because that's easier to take the bias out of the system than it is to take the bias out of the person. And this is very true. Everybody's biased. We're all biased in one way or another. So we need to be looking at our processes and putting them under a tooth comb, and really just under a microscope even, and really looking at, are we doing those fairly? How many people have we got on our panels who are making decisions about the next group of people? And a strategy I came across, a practice I came across, I think it's a brilliant idea, is what's called the why not question. So instead of people being put forward for a promotion by an individual manager, and you knowing who some of those people are, and the other people are just not put on the list, the why not approach means if you're not putting them on the list, you have to argue why you're not putting them on the list. So you actually have to make a case for that. Otherwise, a lot of this this bias can become invisible. I just didn't think they were up to it. They weren't confident enough, and those kinds of descriptors, which sometimes can be used negatively against women that are not confident enough. But that's not really an argument for why somebody shouldn't be promoted unless you can explain that in more detail. So I think things like that, we need to put far more attention on our processes internally and who's running those processes all the way through to get that next level. So I agree with you. Yeah.
There's a reason why women aren't as confident as men in the workplace. So it's just a double-edged sword otherwise, isn't it? How can we just talk about this process and framework versus culture? Because Anthony, you've had an exceptionally high take-up of the of men taking up your shared parental leave scheme. In other organisations, it's not often as high. And I genuinely believe that the gender, and I'd like to talk about this later, that actually this is an at-home issue as well as a workplace issue.
I've got a lot to say about that.
Yeah, absolutely.
We started on that one.
I know you made me really challenge my husband actually the last time we had a call together.
Oh, excellent.
Yeah, I'd like to talk about the workplace culture and this idea of we need C-suite leaders and we need men to feel that they can step up and they can say, actually, it's just as important for me to be at home with the family, or I need to leave early to get the kids. It's not my wife's job to do that. We're a joint team. How important is the culture over the framework and policy, and how do we change culture? This is such a large question that lots of HRBs are asking.
I would say it's fundamental, because I always challenge myself and my team to say, when you read the policies, any of our policies, can you see the corporate values in the words? And then how do you make the words a living reality? So that's fundamental. So I think you can have a great, beautiful prose in the policy, but if it's not lived, it's not genuine, it's worthless. So I think, what I think is really important is that you have a consistent message that you keep talking about. You don't kind of do one big announcement and then stop. So you keep that conversation flowing, you keep that on people's minds, you keep it on the radar, and then it just becomes part of how we do things and who we are as an organization, and then to role model. So what we have done particularly is at various junctures throughout the year, since we launched this, and it will be 3 years in November, is we've taken personal testimonials and created internal news stories and videos and tweets and everything that's really brought that to life. that says, actually, this isn't just a policy that sits in the employee handbook. This is who we are. This is what we do. And you can avail yourselves of that. And I think hearing the stories of how people have said what a difference it's made, people have talked about, it's been life-changing for them and their family. That's so powerful. So actually, I think you have to create that narrative, continually talk about it, and create that space where people say, actually, that's great, and I'm going to do that.
I wanted to add on that the thing that we hear most, and we've worked now with thousands of working parents and carers, right? So the thing that we hear the most consistently is the inconsistency of behaviour amongst line managers in particular. And one of the things that counters that in the most powerful way is exactly what Anthony's talking about, which is role modelling. So if I don't see you, my manager, not the people, and actually some of the people in the senior leadership team, if I don't see them actively living this policy in some way, I don't believe it's really real. And so I'm afraid to go and ask for it, because that might mean that's going to affect my career. So if we're really serious about wanting to get some traction here, we actually have to be actively having role models, contrary role models to what to the ones that we currently have. So we need far more men actively taking flexible work and parental leave, like you're talking about, and that becoming something that we do, and not just something that we do until we get to a management position, but when we're in a management position and when we're in a senior leadership position. So we need a lot more role modeling going on, and then sharing, as you're saying, the stories. That's incredibly powerful, that sharing the stories. But often these things are quite invisible to people.
I completely agree. Having when I first went back to work as a flex worker, I was the only flex worker, none of the managers were, and actually I left pretty soon after because I felt that it wasn't sustainable. Joeli, is that kind of the general consensus that you hear through women, that even if the policy is available, if the company doesn't live it and breathe it, they don't feel that they can do it? It's not taken seriously.
Yeah, I mean, you've got to have a policy in place, obviously, but policies are often a PR stunt in our experience, and it's all to do with the biases that exist within your line manager. Unless those line managers believe in that policy and as you say, role model it, then yeah, I mean, it really doesn't trickle down. There's some great examples of CEOs and senior leaders who do live and breathe those policies. You look at PepsiCo's CEO, he has a leave loudly policy, and he believes we've got to be, he says to his staff, I want you to be a hero at work and a hero at home. And he leaves the office at 5 p.m. prompt, very loudly, to go home and bath his children, and encourages other staff to do the same. Those sorts of actions that CEOs and senior leaders can take will really make a difference to employees and how they feel about asking for those policies. And we know from our own research and from other research that employees don't tend to, for example, ask for the flexible working that they want. They ask for the flexible working that they think they might be able to get from their employer. But then, of course, if that's accepted, it's not actually what they need. And so further down the line, they're going to hit problems, and then they're going to end up leaving the workforce. And that goes the same with maternity leave. We hear from lots of women who don't take the amount of time that they want to because they're scared about their jobs and not being able to get back to work. So it's policy and culture, but culture and employers really understanding why that policy is important and why fulfilling that policy will be good for business makes a massive difference.
Yeah,
and that's where we started from, is in terms of actually this was just good business sense, because actually we want to retain people, we want to retain that quality that enables us to service our customer and to grow the business. So actually you want to use that as a retention tool, you want to use it as a tool to attract people into your organization as well. And I think also from a customer perspective, you kind of say, actually this company says that they've got these values, and actually we can see them living these values. And I think the question is sometimes from a customer perspective, do I see myself mirrored in that organization? So I think there's a really good business model to say, actually, why wouldn't you do these things? So I think all of that coming together it really is just common sense, but you've got to have the culture to do it. Policy in and of itself is fine, but it will just sit there. You've got to bring that to life. And I think, Joeli, going back to your point, I think, I've seen, in other organizations that sometimes you kind of find the very top level are very bought into that, but then you get to a certain level of kind of more middle management level where it becomes a bit more tricky in terms of how do we resource that, how do we make this work. So I think you've got to continue right through the organization to kind of work with leaders to help them understand how they can do that. That actually that's fine.
Yeah, absolutely, which I think is some of the work that you do, Virginia, isn't it? It's not just parents and carers, it's also empowering organisations and managers to be able to make it happen.
It's absolutely critical. I mean, you've got various levels who are going to be involved in this change. You have got government and you've got the society we live in. You've got our government, you've got our organisations that sit in that society. And within those organisations, you've got the management group. And those managers, as I've said, are really inconsistent. And sometimes that's because they actually don't see this yet quite as their role. It's still kind of HR's job. So we're really needing to shift and educate them and shift their mindset around that. And sometimes it's because they actually are a bit nervous about having conversations about this because they're worried that they're going to get into trouble. So what's the safest way to go? The safest way to go is not to have the conversation. So they avoid having conversations that they need to be having. And then that creates more of an issue because as the individual, if an individual is feeling vulnerable already, because say they're about to go on parental leave, and their manager hasn't come to have the conversation with them about it, and they aren't going back the other way, then all sorts of assumptions can be made at that point. So the skilling up to support managers who actually have got quite a tough job on their hands right now, because they're trying to look after how you manage a remote team and manage these kinds of transitions and do more to connect in with people because they're struggling in terms of their own mental well-being probably, and they're all stretched by that. They've got a lot to do, and so I think sometimes they don't get enough support on the how here. How do I have that kind of conversation? And how they might even be worried about sometimes having to say no to something. How do they say no? Yeah, yeah.
Joeli, yes, please go ahead.
Just on what Virginia says, which is interesting, we come across this a lot. And coming back to the women that may be watching this, the mothers that may be watching this, this does happen very commonly. Employers, managers struggle, they panic. Somebody says they're pregnant, they think, lawsuit, or they think, pregnant woman, I don't know how to deal with this. God, we're talking about like breasts and babies growing. I don't understand. So they back away and stop, and the communication breaks down, and the woman thinks, oh right, I'm being pushed out, they don't want to talk to me anymore, they don't want to promote me anymore, they don't want to include me in these conversations, and it deteriorates, the communication deteriorates, the relationship deteriorates. So what we say to women is try, if you feel able to say to your manager, can we have a chat and sit down and say, this is how I feel like these are my concerns, these are my worries, and I feel like you're not interested and you don't want to support me. And often that conversation will just break the glass wall that's built up between the two of you, and will really ease the conversations in the future. And it will, know the law and you know your rights, and you make that very clear in that conversation, again, employers go, oh okay, right, and they start to back off, and you can really smooth over any challenges that have occurred. So try and take that mantle if you can.
Yeah, one of the most powerful things that we've done is when we're doing our parental transition coaching, we in one of the sessions we sit down with the person who's returning and their manager, because sometimes they're both a little nervous about having that conversation, and they need help. They need a facilitator whose role is to bring them together and make sure both positions are heard. And they're just so helpful, because then you sort of set off something that then people can continue after that point, because they've had that first breakthrough and they've had a bit more help just to get that started. So it's very, very good to do that.
Absolutely.
And that, I think, Madeline, is one of the reasons as well, kind of in a broader context, why we introduced a conflict resolution and mediation policy, because actually, you can triage situations quite quickly. And actually, if you go into a formal grievance procedure, you're already at quite a polemic situation.
Yeah.
I'm here, my leader's there. I've got to get then someone in who's going to hear the case and is going to make a judgment call on who was right and who was wrong. So actually, if you kind of break that down into, this is about having an adult to adult conversation, that you can create a safe space where people can say, this is how I'm feeling and why. I can understand why that person's feeling the way they are. They can understand why I'm making those judgment calls. So actually, if you can create that safe space through a kind of triage of understanding firstly what the issue is, then a kind of more facilitated led conversation, which may lead into maybe a more formal mediation. But my experience here at Aviva is that the vast majority of our cases now are all being settled in that facilitated conversation. Right. So it's just about creating that safe space. I think, as you were saying, in terms of, if you can do that, create that space for people to feel comfortable to have those conversations. And it may be that we aren't always going to agree, but we understand on the points that we disagree and what are the points that we do agree on, and how can you work around that. That's invaluable to the kind of whole philosophy of the employment contract, the psychological contract with the employee and the employer.
I think that was the question. How often does that then resolve it without it having to go any further? Because that's the dream, isn't it? No employee or employer wants to take something to court if it can possibly be avoided. I think that's really interesting.
So you're not going to be surprised, Maddy. I have to jump in and say that this here, because we also need that in our homes, Anthony. We actually need to be having better conversations about things like gender equality in our own homes. And just like we avoid those conversations at work, and we do have really good visibility of this because we're working with parents a lot and carers, and they are not happy with how it's happening, but they are not doing what they need to do to have those conversations in their own households. And that is meaning that they can't possibly get to gender parity at work because they have not got anywhere near gender parity in their own home. And part of that absolutely is societal and all the expectations it puts on people and all the judgments people have. And they're very free with their comments around what kind of mother you are or what kind of father you are, how you're supposed to be. But it also does come down to you taking some personal responsibility and having a look at what's going on in your own household and saying, is this okay with me? And what we're very clear about here is there's no judgment from us here on what you do. What you do is up to you, as long as you're comfortable with it. But if you're not comfortable with it and you're sitting with that, you're colluding with the issue here. And our experience is this, the default position, unless previously negotiated, is that all roads on caring and household work lead to mums. This is what they tell us. And they're not necessarily happy with that. But at the same time, they're also kind of thinking it's their job. And how do we get that sense? Because of their language. So they'll often say things like, my partner's very good. My partner's very good. He's very helpful. He's a great support. And if you unpack that language, and I know we've had this conversation before, Maddy, but if you unpack that language, where they get to is they've somehow taken that on, that it is their job to do that. And it's almost a subconscious belief. And we kind of wake them up to the fact that actually that's probably come from society or someone else who might have that belief about what they're supposed to do. And they can make up their own mind now. And then making up their own mind might require them to actually do a job description at home for them and their partner at home, like we do one at work. You can do one of those at home and then share things according to that. So I do think there's some responsibility, and there's some responsibility on men who, when we go through a boundaries exercise with the men, what will come out there is that they will be doing things to help, but they're waiting to be told what to do. So they're not thinking about it. They're not taking on the mental load of what their part needs to be. They're waiting to be given their job. And it's a very different approach. So it's not really sharing the care, it's helping with the care. And I think we need to do a lot of work in our own conversations around supporting individuals to have that kind of conversation at home, which is some of the work that we do. So I think that's really, we can't leave that piece out.
No, I couldn't agree more. Also, it's important within the workplace. I mean, I've personally been victims of why are you here if you've got small children, of an evening function, or comments like that. So just as much as you're expected to still be ambitious, still put in overtime, still do everything that you would have done before you had any caring responsibilities, you're also then questioned when you do that as to why you aren't at home. So I think it's equally as important to call it out at home and in the workplace.
Yeah. And men, we find that men get really disadvantaged here because they still have got a really strong feeling they need to provide, and they feel the pressure of that. And if they're not doing that, they feel, or they're told, they're a bit soft. I mean, this is just so unhelpful.
I agree with you, and I think this is what we've seen through the equal parental leave, actually, is that if you start to remove some of those boundaries and challenge some of those societal kind of biases, men really do want to be involved.
Yes, they do.
So I think if you open that way and clear off some of that old baggage and what have you, they do want to be involved. But I think it's in terms of how will I look maybe with my manager, how will I look with my friends outside of work, how do I look to my colleagues? Is it the right thing to do for a guy to be taking the lead? So actually, if you kind of say it is, and you clear some of that, you challenge those stereotypes. That goes back to culture. It goes back to culture. And actually, if you can start to change that, maybe, hopefully, I would always say in a few years' time, people won't be talking about, that whole thing around who's taking leave will be a thing of the past. There won't be a gender differentiation.
I hope so. We're running out of time. So just before we finish, is there anything anybody would like to add? We've covered an awful lot of ground.
Just to say, men are much less likely to have a flexible working request accepted than women because of these cultural issues that men are seeing. Why on earth would you want to care for your offspring? That's surely and that creates massive problems. But actually, I mean, I've just written a book about all of this, so I have loads of stats at my fingertips. So I'll probably leave you with a couple of quite interesting stats. Firstly, if men spend 24 hours with a child in their first year of life without the mother around, a couple are 40% more likely to stay together. 40 more likely to stay together. There was some incredible research done by a university which showed that if women return to work quite quickly after having a baby, they're seen as not caring and really cold and emotionless. If they take their full maternity leave, they're seen as not competent and not committed to their work. And we know that a third of employers avoid hiring women of childbearing age, a third, and obviously that's completely invisible discrimination. So women are going to these interviews not realising that the fact that they've got a wedding ring on their finger is preventing them from getting that job. And it's a massive contributor to the gender pay gap. But it's a massively complex issue, is the motherhood penalty. There are so many differences, but companies like Aviva, there are some other great companies as well that are doing what they can to fix this problem. We need to disseminate that information as much as we can and show the business case so that businesses, policymakers start to really up their game and see that this is good for the economy, it's good for families, it's good for business if we fix the problem, and it will reduce child poverty. Children are not poor by themselves, they're poor because their mothers are poor. So this is all about creating a happier, more prosperous country.
Yeah, I agree, and I think it's just, large organisations, but organisations really of any size, I think shouldn't underestimate what a difference they can make. Firstly, to the lives of their employees, their wider families, but also in terms of how that can contribute to a societal shift in the change of that. So actually, I think, as you were saying there, Joeli, in terms of actually how do you then start to change that wider societal narrative on some of these questions and really start to challenge and push the boundaries on some of that. And I think it's through that we will start to see effective and lasting change.
And my final word really is that I think this change is going to happen at 4 different levels. It is going to happen at this. We need to see change at the societal and government level. We need to see organisations like Aviva stepping up, regardless of what the government is doing, going, you know what, we're going to have good policies anyway. And we need managers doing their part, because they're the ones who help this happen in practice. And then we need individuals stepping up. And the question that individuals need to ask is one of our favourite questions, obviously, as coaches, is what, if anything, can I do about this? Because there's always something somebody can do. And as you do something, you influence the people around you, and then they influence the people around you, and that's how it happens. So I think there's a responsibility of what, if anything, can I do at all those levels. And that's probably why our business is called How Do You Do It?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you all so much for your time today, and thank you very much to the audience who've taken the time to watch. I really hope that there's some and I'm sure there will be some actual kind of tips and tools for how to make change within your own organisation, and also just some horrifying stats and some support about why this is so important and why we need to take action. So thank you. As I mentioned, I was joined today by Joeli Brearley of Pregnant Then Screwed. Thank you very much, Joeli, for giving up your time today. Anthony Fitzpatrick, who is I have to read your title, Anthony, because it's very long, is the Head of Colleague Experience and Employment Policy at Aviva. So thank you so much, Anthony, for sharing the best practice that you have today. And Virginia Herlihy, the founder of How Do You Do It. Thank you, Virginia. You've imparted loads of wisdom there as well about what we can do as individuals and as organisations. So thank you all very much, and we'll see you on the next session. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Hello and welcome to the Flexpo business session on the future of equality, understanding the impact that COVID-19 has had on gender equality and how we can accelerate the pace of change. I'm Madeline Cole, the founder of the Flexpo event series, and I'm joined today by 2 fantastic speakers. I have Jane Funsale, the CEO of an organisation that we all know incredibly well, Working Families, and Ian Dinwiddy, the founder of Inspiring Dads. Thank you very much both for joining us today.
Hi, Maddy. Good to be here.
Hi, Maddy. Great to be here.
Thank you both. So if we kick off, we'll get straight into the session. If we kick off with your understanding of the impact that COVID has had on gender equality. Jane, shall we start with you?
Yeah, as many of you know, Working Families operates a legal advice line. And we found as schools closed that the legal advice line was starting to get 5 times the volume of queries that we would normally get. We were absolutely swamped. And one of the most interesting things and sad things from our perspective that we saw was that mothers were being told that they couldn't work from home. Their counterparts who were fathers didn't have that conversation with their employers at all. The assumption was that if you were a woman, you would be looking after your children exclusively, whereas if you were a father, you wouldn't be looking after your children at all. There would be no childcare responsibility happening. And for us, that was just awful and appalling. And of course, for single parents, both men and women, they wanted to be furloughed if they had children who were very young, because as a charity, we've always said that home working is no substitute for childcare. If you've got 2 kids under 5 or however many children under 5, trying to work during the day while entertaining their small children is just not going to happen. So for those parents, they absolutely wanted to be furloughed. But for many parents, particularly parents who really needed that income coming in and were really concerned about their future employment possibilities, it was a really, really difficult time.
Absolutely, thank you. And I don't think we yet truly understand the implications of those who were and weren't furloughed. I know, as you say, there was a much higher number of women that were furloughed. I think we as we approach the end of the furlough scheme, we're yet to kind of see the shakeout of that and how many of those women have lost their jobs or retained those jobs.
Yeah, certainly on our helpline, we're already starting to see queries about employers who are imposing a change of hours. And again, one of the things that we're seeing is that there's no consideration about childcare. And we are interested and concerned about what's going to happen for parents who are using breakfast clubs or after school clubs, because we have a suspicion that those won't be available. Because when children are going back to school, they're going back in their bubbles.
Yep.
I think for schools, it's going to be extraordinarily difficult to manage those kinds of clubs where you would have kids from all kinds of classes joining in together at the breakfast club, but they now won't be able to because they'll have to be in their bubbles.
Well, I can confirm that they aren't going ahead as a parent.
My kids are. Yeah, they are due to start breakfast club, but I think that's unusual, as you say, Maddy. I think that's one of the things when you take away these childcare provision that predominantly working mums have relied on, then you start to open up and shine a light on other inequalities, I think, within the system and within the working practices. As much the culture of those assumptions, Jane, that you were saying around the assumptions about who's going to look after the children. Yeah. I think it's as much the assumption as is necessarily the reality. We know that we know that women have done a lot more, or mums, I think, when we're talking about gender equality, really, we're talking about mums and dads, really, in this space. Yeah. Mums have done a lot more in terms of childcare and a lot more in terms of home school. Dads have done a lot more too, but not to the same extent. So actually, perversely, although there's a really good story in terms of equality in some ways, in terms of equality of labour at home, then I think there are concerns that not only has it opened up an even greater gap than there already was, there are issues around assumptions and issues around something we'll touch on it a bit later on, I think, in terms of the fear that men possibly feel in terms of pushing back and the dynamics of individual households, especially where both couples are working, and what are the priorities for that household, and how does that then play out in terms of equality both at home and in the workplace.
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, I think just in terms of what you just said, Ian, I've seen lots of people talking about it, that, you know, it was kind of here for men and here for women, and now it's here for women and it is here for men. So men are doing more, but women are doing incrementally more. Interesting what you said about change of hours, Jane. Is that is that they're expecting them to go back to their normal contracts, or that they are expecting to completely revamp how they were working?
We don't know yet, because what we're not able to pick this out as a theme, and we've done some reports. We did a report called Weathering the Storm, where we looked at some of the themes of issues that were coming out right at the start of this process. So we are now beginning to see in the last week or so lots more queries about imposed changes of hours. But what I can't say is whether or not what that looks like in terms of the theme that's coming. But what we're seeing is people being asked to work perhaps more part-time, or being asked to work in a slightly different pattern to the way that they were. Because we know that for many parents and particularly mums who were working part-time, what they may have done in order to share the burden of childcare with their partners is, instead of working 3 full days, they might have been taking those hours and working them over the 5 days. Now, any of those kinds of imposed changes are going to have a significant impact depending on what your childcare arrangements are. So that's going to be the challenge for all of those parents. Is anything to do with childcare is going to be, if their employers aren't considering it, is going to have a real negative impact on their ability to continue to work. And it's that detachment from the labour market that we're really worried about, in terms of not young people, but also working parents.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm worried I've made this stat up, but who better to ask, really? Is it about 84% of the workforce that have parent responsibilities, whether they're parents or?
Well, we know there are 13 million working parents in the UK, and there are more people who, in addition, have caring responsibilities for adults. So it's a lot of people.
It's 75% of women. 75% of women with dependent children are working, and men and that's the highest it's ever been as of October 2019. That was Office of National Statistics. Men is 93%, I think. So women is at the highest ever. So actually, and this is dependent children. That's over, not even including any other caring responsibilities and that side of things. So yeah, it's significant both in scale and proportion. So any change, any enforced change is going to hit a lot of people, a lot of women in particular, I think.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, and I think I always wonder, I mean, we kind of sit in the position that we understand why gender equality is so important and how flexible working is an enabler of gender equality. And I think most HR professionals do, ethics aside, and, equal opportunities, but actually fundamentally, the business reasons as to why this needs to be addressed. Do you think all employers think like that? Or do you think for some HR professionals, they need to be armed with the skills to go, this is why we need to be supportive of working mothers or working fathers or whatever that might look like?
I think good businesses understand it, and they understand the bigger picture. And you only have to look at the scale of increase in terms of paid, fully paid paternity leave, or actually it's really called parental leave, really, when it's fully paid and equalised. And I think there's around about 50 companies that I'm aware of who do that, who to a large extent either enhance their shared parental leave offer or they've equalised it altogether. So there are good businesses out there, but they tend to be large blue chips. They tend to be focused on London in particular, I think, or certainly head offices in London. And so I guess we need to be mindful that there are different businesses are at different life cycles in terms of their understanding of the importance. For some businesses, I think the best will in the world is literally getting the job done, and anything beyond that, and anything that complicates that, I think in some ways, is something they don't feel able to take on. I mean, the great thing about things like legislation around shared parental leave is that at its base point, it's quite a modest and problematic mechanism for increasing the opportunities for fathers to be more involved in their children's lives. However, it was a signal. That's the first thing, and it was a signal to society and businesses more generally that this is the direction of travel. Yeah. So I think we talk a lot about Aviva's work and being at the forefront of that. But I think that work didn't start until the legislation around shared parental leave came in. So it starts to indicate and it starts to move on. So I think some businesses are really, really great, and individuals within those businesses, but banging the drum men need to be, dads need to be out there saying, actually, this is important. Being an active and involved parent, a father, is really important to my identity. It's not just about dividing up these elements of our lives. I think that's one of the great things about lockdown in particular, is that potentially we have a lot of men who previously had been, in the best will in the world, have been removed from that to a certain extent. And I think now, if we can harness some of that desire and support and take away some of the fear that you won't be seen as committed, then more and more men will fundamentally change the way they work, which is an enabler for everyone else, to be honest.
So sorry, Jane.
Sorry, Maddy, last Father's Day, International Men's Day, I think it was, I went and did a talk for some younger men, so late 30s, early 40s, who were working for a very large blue chip services company. And they had a really good quality parental leave scheme. They had 6 months at, I think, something like 80 or 90% of salary. So pretty close to full pay. And those young men were in mostly dual income relationships. So they were in a situation perhaps where their partners weren't being paid at quite the same rate, or in fact didn't get the same kind of benefit. So all of those men had taken 6 months worth of parental leave. They loved it. They thought it was absolutely extraordinary. They'd been encouraged by their employer to take that leave. Their immediate line managers had been very supportive of that. What they found, though, coming back to work, was that many of them then wanted to continue that relationship and the way of working that they had, and they wanted to work more flexibly, either doing a variety of things, perhaps a day at home, perhaps a compressed 9-day, fortnight or a 4-day week, various things that they wanted to try. And that was when they really came into a problem, because although their immediate bosses were supportive, it was the next layer up that were saying things, as Ian has alluded to earlier on, about not being committed. And so for us, it's great that HR professionals are supporting flexible working and supporting working parents, but that needs to be modelled and it needs to be supported by the most senior people within the organisation, because it's only then that you get the kind of culture change which then leads to the huge benefit in productivity, in diversity, in different ways of looking at things, in different ways of solving problems.
Absolutely. And I think, you know, we kind of started this conversation with the impact that COVID has had, and we've been very much talking about how mothers have picked up the impetus on, or predominantly, it's not fair to say that men haven't completely, because I'm sure they have in certain households. Ian, I'm sure yours included, yeah. And mine in certain topics, because turns out I can't do year one maths, not ashamed to say. But I mean, you know, I think this is potentially kind of two different issues, isn't it? What can employers be doing now to ensure that women can return, the women that have picked up the bulk, which is the majority of women, but also let's talk future proofing. How do we prevent this being a women's issue? How do we make this a far more equal workplace?
Mm-hmm. And also, you know, we know there's been a motherhood penalty. In certain circumstances, it now looks like there's a fatherhood penalty, because men who are taking on more caring responsibilities are now being put into exactly the same, you know, pot of, are you committed enough? Are you working hard enough? All of those kinds of ridiculous questions. And what we don't want is a parenthood penalty, because frankly, we have a social contract with anybody who does to have children, which is that you will continue to have children in order that we as a society carry on, you know, the future workers of the world. But in order to do that, we want to lead a society which is as equal as possible, where everybody gets the opportunity to work and to take pleasure in the work that they do, but also that they can parent.
Absolutely. So how, share with us, if you would, share with us some kind of top tips, or some, you know, where does an employer start? An employer that doesn't go beyond the typical government standard around maternity and paternity leave, of which that's most employers. How do they begin to address this?
Well, certainly for us, one of the things that we've seen is that really, really tiny organisations tend to be actually really much better at flexible working, because they've invested so much in training the people that they have working with them, that at a point when those people need to work slightly more flexibly, whether that's mums or dads, actually those micro businesses do make themselves much more flexible, because they simply don't want to lose those skills and abilities. So for us, one of the ways in which we think flexible working is made much more attractive is and not just more attractive, but actually more sensible for everybody, is for the employer to design jobs well, so they are human-sized. Because we know, certainly from the Modern Families Index that we've been doing for the last 9-10 years, is that very many working parents will either be trapped into a job that's flexible because they can't leave that employer because they have no idea that they're going to get that flexibility elsewhere, or they will be putting in so many more hours because they're so desperate to keep that job because it does afford them some kind of flexibility. And actually that's just not good use of people's time. And we know that parents are actually very skilled multi-skillers. They're very good at concentrating a lot of effort into small periods of time. So we'd be very keen on good quality job design, ensuring that the job is human-sized, and measuring people by their output, not by the number of hours they are sitting at their desks, whether that is at home or in the office.
I love that, human-sized jobs. I love that expression. Ian, did you want to add to that?
Yeah, I think there's an element around culture, around the opportunity to support men who take leave, or you know, if we're talking about small businesses where it's statutory, paternity leave, then actually supporting men to understand sort of the emotional upheaval that they face, because actually the reality is something like only about 67% of men who become parents are even eligible to take those statutory 2 weeks. So I think that businesses should put in place mentoring programs, internal mentoring programs, where dads get a chance within those first couple of weeks of coming back. So if it's only 2 weeks, and within 4 weeks of that baby being born or being adopted, is to speak to an experienced dad and process, and almost be forced into processing the experience and the change that is coming their way. I think sometimes men are surprised a little bit by the upheaval that happens in their lives, and they're back to work, and there's an assumption you just carry on and almost in many ways redouble your efforts. So I think businesses relatively simply could put in, right, you need to take 2 hours out of your life to talk to choose one of these mentors from inside the business, experienced dads who are a little bit further ahead of you in terms of the curve, and talk through what's happened for you and for your family and what you're worried about, and start to process that, so that you can do a lot to sort of support mental health, and also open the possibility around having conversations around flexible working, and having conversations around designing work to fit your life, this new life that you're starting, and this new kind of arrangement you need to be mindful of. I think it's very easy for men just to kind of, like I said, redouble their efforts. Possibly, they're looking at having going from dual income to single income in the future, and feeling like actually everything's on me. Those traditional sort of stereotypes around being a breadwinner are really, really important for men, and men really feel the pressure. Giving them somewhere to talk about that can create a different culture within a business that treats fatherhood in a slightly different way, and that has knock-on effects, I think, for everyone, in terms of diversity, both in terms of gender and in every other way that we can imagine, because men are 80% of all men become dads at some stage in their life, and supporting them even in a low-key way can have a big benefit for both them and their families and the workplace.
Yeah, I agree. Great ideas there. Sorry, Jane.
Yeah, so sorry, Maddy. One of the Working Families Employer members is one of the armed forces. And one of the things that they were saying at a webinar we held was they were talking about the fact that some of their most senior leaders are men, which is, I guess, unsurprising. But what has been wonderful about lockdown is that those men have been seen as dads, with very young children suddenly appearing in the background. As we know from Zoom interviews with little people suddenly appearing. But particularly for dads, it's been really helpful in both humanizing people, but also, again, as Ian was suggesting, that cultural change and seeing that being led from the top. That actually, if the most senior man in your company has small children and clearly is enjoying having those small children around, that can only encourage other people. And we're a long way away from the 1970s, when dads were spending, on average, 15 minutes a day with their children. The world has changed immeasurably for the better.
Yeah, absolutely. Let's hope they were enjoying their children being part of that, and they didn't have their hands over their faces mid-Zoom call.
Oh, I'm sure a little bit of that happened too.
Yeah, for sure.
Dads are people too.
Well, I love that this happened, didn't it? There was the newsreader, I can't remember which channel it was, and his wife kind of came scurrying in and grabbed a child by the ankle while he was like that trying to finish, and we've seen so much more of that over lockdown, and that is life, isn't it? That's part of being a family. I'd really welcome your opinions on both of these, actually, and this is slightly off of the gender equality topic, although not, because it's all linked. One of the biggest things that we often get asked from an HRD perspective is this the challenge around inconsistency. So people feeling that other people in the organisation are being treated differently because of certain reasons. So, she's allowed to do a 3-day week because she's a mother, or whatever that might be. And I think that's really damaging for the mothers and also for the company culture. And that's why I firmly believe that flex should be for all. And you shouldn't have to give a reason for that. Are you in agreement? Because I think this should start way before you become parents. I think we should be looking at this, as a workplace, as a workplace community, that actually we should be encouraging flex from the off.
Well, we certainly know that the millennial generation definitely want to work flexibly. You know, for them, the idea of going into an office 9 to 5, 5 days a week is kind of complete madness. Why would you do that? But also, so many of them have interests outside of their jobs. So they quite often have, and I know it sounds ridiculous for me to say this, but they quite often have side hustles. You know, basically, they're interested in something else and they really want to spend some time doing that. And that extends to people who have, you know, real passion for sports. Anybody who wants to take their sports really seriously actually needs to put some time in. So I think there will be a huge change as that younger generation starts coming through, because they will want to take on flexible working as a way of managing their lives. It's not just about parenting or caring. It's actually about everybody wants to work flexibly in some way.
Yeah. No, I totally agree, Jane. I think that's that shift comes through in surveys all the time. Is that you know that's both enabled by technology, in the sense that Job for Life isn't something that people necessarily aspire to, and it's much more of a portfolio, and the opportunity to do that. And yeah, it's a generational change, and it will happen naturally, and the businesses who will gain the best staff ultimately will be the ones who can offer and see the opportunity for offering a range of options, so that people have a choice, so that it's not just for those people who want to be in the office for long hours. Then great, if that's what you really want to do. But for those people who want to be there 3 days, 4 days, matching up those skills and opening up the recruitment process to a much broader and wider, the biggest pool of talent possible, I think, really.
Yeah. One of our employer members, again, an organisation called Zurich, they have had the most fantastic success with advertising all of their roles as flexible. So initially, when they started doing this, it was a bit of a diktat from the top to say, you will now advertise all jobs flexibly. And the jobs were advertised in such a way that there was the name of the role, and then in brackets afterwards it said part-time flexible job share, so that there was an opportunity to look at doing that job in all kinds of different ways. Personally, I'm a huge fan of job shares, because I think you get a lot more than double the right, you know, the interest and the ability when you have two people sharing a role. And frankly, nobody else is quite as interested in your job as somebody doing exactly the same job.
Yeah.
So that's great fun. But what Zurich found was that advertising these jobs in this way led to a 25% increase in the number of, I think it was 23% increase in the number of women applying for these roles, and a 45% increase in the number of women applying for senior roles, which obviously, if those women are then appointed and if those women are promoted, will do fantastic things for their gender pay gap. But the other thing that was really interesting was that apparently overall there was an increase in the quality of applications and the number of applications, because it was obviously attractive to both men and women that these jobs were being advertised in this way. The signal that goes out to the market that this is actually an employer who is interested in getting the best out of the people they're employing is obviously going to be something that attracts people who are interested in the work that they do and want to bring their whole selves to the office, but actually want to work for an employer that does appear to give that human piece real consideration within the working time.
Absolutely, and I'd love to see their retention rates, because like you say, once people are with a flexible organisation, they're often nervous to leave, but also more importantly, feel much more closely aligned and valued with the organisation that they're with.
Yep. And one of the things that BAYS, the department, wanted to do, I'm sure we all remember the Queen's speech, which, and the government, I know, and the government said within that, that one of the things that they wanted to do was to encourage employers to advertise all roles flexibly, unless there was a really good reason that they couldn't be advertised flexibly. So it would be flexible by default, which obviously we are hugely supportive of. And that is something that really, really needs to be pushed through now in order to get that, that change. But the other thing that the department were then looking at was, how can we get organisations to actually advertise the flexible policies they have?
Yeah.
Earlier, and you mentioned it too, Maddy, that sometimes parents, men and women, can get trapped in roles that offer the kind of flexibility they need to manage their lives. You know, that within the public service, there was a chap I met, he is the carer for his mother-in-law. His wife works as a teacher. He was working for the civil service, and it was much easier for him to work, to flex his working day in order that he could provide the care, because his wife as a teacher simply couldn't be there during certain hours. But if organisations advertise their policies, it will make the ability of parents to choose which roles they apply for so much easier. And of course, I think it's probably why, as we said, Zurich got such good quality applicants for their roles.
Definitely, and I think also as an employee, it's one of the questions that you're most scared to ask, isn't it? You know, can I see the paternity policy, because straight away, and the flex policy, people are going to go, why are you asking? You know, can you imagine that, you know, especially in an old-fashioned organisation, of which there are still so many, where that's not normal. You know, it's, oh, so-and-so's asking to see maternity, why do you think that is? It's almost like you're not allowed to prepare for your future career and safeguard it by asking those questions.
Yeah, and you've got that 26 week sort of period of time where in theory, you know, everything's like you can only ask after 26 weeks, and you know, anything that can break that. I mean, in terms of Jane, in terms of the legislation bit, it was really interesting that I think it was Helen Whatley, she's a Conservative MP. She had a private members bill that she started to get moving, but this is obviously circumstances overtook them last summer, I guess, in terms of the Theresa May and Boris Johnson becoming Prime Minister. But she, as a Conservative MP, then she was pushing quite heavily for the flex day one flexibility as a private members bill. So hopefully at some stage that'll get its chance again.
Yeah. We actually inquired to try and get Helen as a speaker for this series, and she's been taken off in a completely different direction, and it's now no longer part of her remit. So it's so frustrating, isn't it, for us when we're trying to force the agenda. And when obviously this was pre-COVID, so hopefully in light of what's currently happened, there'll be a change. I mean, I do think it's a real shame that the gender pay gap reporting was cancelled for this year, especially this year of all years. We talked about this on the panel discussion part one. And then the message that sends to, you know, employees about whether the government care or not about gender equality, and the overwhelming film was very negative, which I'm sure you two would probably agree with.
Yeah, although having said that, there are a large number of organisations who are choosing still to report on their gender pay gap, and hats off to them, because it is an added burden for them in terms of the reporting that they need to do. But they would already have been doing that reporting. They would already have been looking at that gender disaggregated data. So why not carry on doing it? You know, it's the first year that they're being asked to do this.
Yeah, definitely. That's really, really strong. And I mean, on that kind of note as well, and we've touched upon, you know, flexible working as an enabler for gender equality, and we've talked a lot about shared parental leave. I mean, my question to both of you really is, which, if you could only pick one as an organisation, which is more powerful? Because a lot of this comes down to budget, I can imagine. So shared parental leave is obviously at a cost potentially for the employer. Flexible working isn't necessarily. I mean, feel free to argue with me. But which do you think is more powerful? You know, as an employer that does neither, where can you start? Which is going to be more successful in the gender equal race?
My view very much would be around flexible working and getting that encouraged from the top of the organisation. And it is still true that most organisations are run by men. So if a man was taking time off to spend with his grandchildren or his children, depending on his age, or caring responsibilities for perhaps an older parent. That sends such a powerful signal throughout the organisation. And then in terms of trusting people to do the work that they need to do, and doing work that is, as we talked about earlier, this human-sized job design, that for me, because it, you know, if you allow a new dad to say work half days for a period of time, that's not shared parental leave. What that is flexible working.
Mm.
May not be perfect, but at least it's a start.
Yeah, and you want those senior people, Jane, to be telling that story. I think men are very good at they self-report quite high levels of flexible working. But I think a lot of it is ad hoc flexibility. It's not contractual flexibility. It's not every Thursday I leave at 3 o'clock because of this, and that's not talked about. It's a conversation often with line managers, and it's about, as much as anything, it's ad hoc, and it's about helping out in some form, helping their partner, picking up the slack, doing things that make you look almost like a little bit of a hero in terms, you know, take it working from home when it's school sports day, whatever it might be. Men are good at doing that sort of thing. They're less prepared, I think, to put their necks on the line, as it were, for things that are structurally built in, that are 4 days a week, and they tend not to talk about it as much. I had a really interesting example last year where I got introduced to someone who's a partner, a guy called Dominic, who's a partner in a law firm, introduced by a friend of mine. So it's got a really great story, and he was working 4 days a week, but there were a couple of clients who knew about it, and most of his clients didn't know about it. And I interviewed him, and then we did a piece for Daddy Life, and we put the piece live on the Friday, and by Sunday he'd come back and said, actually, I want to go public with my name and my business. And over the course of the weekend, he'd had this conversation saying there's no reason why we can't talk about this and tell this as a really great story. He just hadn't really thought about it in that way. Conversations internally, yes, we're going to tell half my clients, you know, some of my clients, not quite half, but some of my clients knew, but the rest of them just didn't realize he would answer emails first thing on a Friday morning and then not respond again, because that was just how it worked. So over the course of the weekend, he went public with it, and it became a really great story about talking about it, and they were able to talk about it internally. So I think not just doing it, but also being seen to be you know, experiencing and sharing those sort of fatherhood moments, those parenting time, so that it doesn't just become an issue for mums. And that's what I think in a lot of businesses, you know, that inward looking, leaning in is a great concept, but it can miss the point that, you know, there are a whole group of people within a business who should and can be allies, both for their own benefit and for the benefit of those people around them, I think.
You've talked to me before, Ian, about allies, and I think a lot of what we've, which I'd love you to talk more about now, if you can. I think a lot of what we've talked about is effectively changing an organisation's culture, which is one of the hardest things to do. And we've got some great ideas now around, you know, C-suite leaders and allies within the workplace, you know, coaching, mentoring, and also I think it's removing that bias, isn't it? Which is, you know, impossible to do. You've only got to look at the headlines currently with everything that's going on. You know, people are inherently biased in one way or another, in a positive and a negative way, in lots of different kind of spheres. So how do we remove that gender bias, and how do we make it acceptable for men to go, no, actually, I want to support my family, this is how I want to work, and raise their head above the parapet when they are potentially going to get sneered at by their colleagues?
I think going back to assumptions that we started with at the start, men assume that it's going to be a problem much more than it actually is. When you talk to guys who have experienced shared parental leave or have actually asked for 4 days a week, 3 days a week, whatever it might be, then it's much more permissible and kind of like men are starting to say, good for you. You know, I want to do this, you know, and they start ganging together and say, actually, this is possible. And, you know, a lot of what I do, and a lot of what I like to talk about on social media, LinkedIn in particular, is about shining the light on on men who are doing things differently, and encourage men within a business to start to create allies of who else is doing things like this. Did a workshop with ExxonMobil last year, and actually all 16 of the guys in that particular workshop were all working flexibly in some way or other, and we had a really great conversation about what that meant and what it allowed them to do and what they would do differently, because they had an opportunity to get together within a structure. And supporting those kind of dad community initiatives, I think, is really important. So it's not just get together. It's not just something to do with alcohol and going to the pub, because men will talk about men are. I know this because I talk to men about it. No, we're very good at compartmentalizing our lives. So we have our work persona, we have our talking about sport persona, we have our family persona, but they don't often cross over in meaningful conversations. But when they do, it's really, really powerful. And men start to realize, actually, this, it's really important for me to be seen as a good father and as a good partner. But sometimes it needs a little bit of a push.
That's really interesting, actually, and we've heard some great stories about from their other halves saying, I had no idea that my person is this stereotypical office persona of works in a certain way. And it's really funny how home working, and in light of the pandemic, has kind of forced people to mash all three together. You're on a Zoom call to a colleague that you might have been very formal with previously, but you've got your child kicking off in the background and your wife can hear what you're saying, and it's so entertaining listening to the feedback from people's other halves. Jane, just to bring you in here, if I may, I think one of the challenges often faced is there's some really great initiatives that we've gone through, and Ian was just talking about even more. But how do HR leaders empower managers to make all of these happen and to embrace these and to be kind of non-fearful of it? Because we've trained managers throughout the last 100 years to monitor via output, not via outcome. And now all of a sudden we're going, no, encourage flexible working, let them do what they want, send the men out. It's almost, they're going, well, hang on a minute, that's not what you've asked us to do. So how can we empower managers who aren't part of these conversations necessarily, to run with policies, but to embrace this new culture?
I feel so sorry for managers, because it's, they're put in this impossible position. They're being asked to do more with less in a different way, and nobody is helping them, or it can feel to them like nobody is helping them get through this. So one of the things for us that is really important is training. Support managers to be coaches, support managers to look at really what's the most important thing. Do I want this job done, and how do I want this job done? Not, am I going to stand over somebody 9 to 5? Because frankly, if you're standing over somebody from 9 to 5 every day, they're not going to be doing their best work. But training for us would be a big thing, encouraging managers to be as open-minded as possible. And sometimes it's also about, exactly as Ian was saying earlier on, that kind of peer support. So if there's a manager who manages it particularly well, using them as a coach for other managers can be a really good and cheap solution. There's no cost involved there. And you will frequently find that the managers that have the most cohesive teams, the teams that work best together, are often very flexible, because they will be responding to what people need. And then, of course, they'll be getting that extra work back from the people in their team. And there'll probably be more collaboration happening. I'm putting this as if there is the perfect manager and the never going to be good enough manager. And of course, we are all both of those things all the time. But certainly training would be one of the really big things that we would push for.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Ian, did you want to add anything?
No, not at all. No, that's
I'm out. I'm just conscious of the time and us running out of time. So before we end, I'd really love to ask both of you if you had one piece of advice for an organisation or a people leader to be able to impart real change on their gender pay gap potentially, but the gender equality piece. It can be in light of COVID, so kind of current advice for dealing with this situation, or longer term future proofing like we were talking about, or both. But yes, what would you like to share?
I think for me, it's certainly sort of, I hesitate to say post-COVID. I think that's possibly saying it a little bit too much. But in the current circumstances, then I think the important thing is not just to assume that childcare is a responsibility solely for working mums. I think that there needs to be a lot of care taken in terms of understanding individual circumstances, because men may not feel like they can say no to moves to bring them back into the workplace, or to work longer hours, or to work differently. They may not be able to feel that they can say no. There is a fear factor involved in not being seen as fully committed. That's slowly changing, but it's something that affects men in a way that possibly doesn't affect women in quite the same way, largely because we just generally, that assumption piece, we assume that men are, men may not don't have childcare assumptions. I think that's the dangerous thing, is to actually dig deeper and to find out how do you need to work in order to support your family and to support the rest of your wider family life, in order to be able to get your job done and also be able to contribute to family life, and not just assume that it's a problem for women.
Thank you. It sounds so simple when you say it, and I don't think I've ever heard anybody say it quite so concisely, but it's so enlightening, isn't it? Just to say to the male members of your team, how can we support you and your family? It just so rarely happens. Thank you very much, Ian. Jane?
For me, it would always be around job design. Making sure that every job is designed in such a way that the organisation understands what it is that they want at the end of it, what's the outcome that they want, and how can that job be done. And then it's about trusting people that you have employed and who you are paying to do that job, so that they can do it in ways that allow them to make the kind of changes in their working practices that they need. So human-sized jobs that have sensible outcomes in terms of what it is that the organisation wants. And for us, it's about trying to keep as many people in employment as possible. So definitely job design.
Thank you. I love that expression, human-sized jobs. I think that's my most favourite. And it totally revolutionises, doesn't it, what we're talking about. One of our other speakers and exhibitors of the event is a guy called Paul, who has the Flexpo Working Detox. And one of the exercises that he does is to get other people to describe what somebody else's role is. And he said he had one occasion where they had a woman in the room and nobody actually knew what she did, and neither did she. And I think it's just not in a nasty way, but I think we do sometimes get so hung up on ticking all the corporate boxes that we lose sight of the bigger mission and values, and why we're all there and what we're all there to do. Thank you all so much. Thank you both so much for your time and your wisdom. That was so helpful. And actually what I loved about the chat today was there was an awful lot of tools and practical advice as well for our audience to take away. So to our audience, I really hope that that's been helpful, and you've got a little bag of tricks to go back and hopefully make actionable actions straight away. So thank you all for watching. Thank you both for joining us, and we'll see you on the next session.
Thanks, Maddy. Cheers, Ian.
Thank you.